Hey, good afternoon, you beautiful bunch. I'm Teacher Jess, and welcome back to GR Cafe. How you guys doing? Got your coffee? Coffee. Adulting is hard. Hmm. Hope you've all had a good week. So I was thinking for today, we can look at a more interesting natural disaster. Um, Thought we could check out earthquakes and everything that goes into earthquakes, how they're formed, the basics behind earthquakes, and how we measure them and how different places try to prepare for earthquakes and see if we can find some case studies on it. Okay, this is actually, there we go. Great. Okay, so I figured I'd just start with a few notes to explain the background and the theory of earthquakes. So earthquakes, I think we generally understand it's a sudden movement of the ground. Yes. But what actually causes them? So before we can understand earthquakes, I want to take a moment to look at plate tectonics. So the Earth's crust is what's this? Is broken up into these plates. Found this really nice picture that kind of floats on top of the mantles. And that's where we have these plates, and the plates they kind of collide and move into each other with the mantle's convection. You can see with the arrows over here more or less what direction they move into. So over here you can see they're moving apart from each other. Over there, that one is moving into that one, and these are colliding in both directions. Divergent boundary is where you have two plates separating each other. Convergent boundary is two converging together, and transform is where they are just moving in opposite directions. And I really like this diagram that shows you why we have this movement in the different places. We have new rock or new crust being formed. So it is spewing out from the mantle over there and it's solidifying to form rock. And that pushes in the two different directions. So that's diverging like that, creating new land. And it pushes the rest of the rock or the rest of the crust into the other continental crust over here. So it immediately gets pushed underneath. That there we have a subduction zone there. Okay, show you this on the map. It looks like a thin seam, and you've got these lines that are going out in either direction. So you have a tiny little faint crack line going down here, and then you have these across lines leading out of it. That is where you have a divergent boundary, and these lines over here is from where the new crust is formed. So in the middle, that is the boundary, and then it pushes it into both directions. It goes all the way up, kind of looks like it's stretched all the way up over here, and then collides here, and is forced to subduct by this continental crust. Okay, so now that we just have a basic understanding of these plate boundaries, these are massive movements. They're very slow, but they're very powerful movements. And at these boundaries, things don't always go smoothly. Obviously, it's rock. It's not made to just neatly slide past each other. And when that energy gets released, uh, either with a crack or a sudden jolt, up, no, it will cause violent movement and shudder. Okay, so you've got this violent movement that, or some kind of a cracking that happens. I like this diagram because it shows the crust being forced and subducted under the other crust. And you can see this lovely little line of hurricanes, of volcanoes that form over here from the weaknesses in that crust. So when there's some kind of a fracture or breakage in this boundary, or anyway, it doesn't even have to be on that exact boundary line, it's in the vicinity of the boundary, then you will have an earthquake. So let's take a look at the basic anatomy of an earthquake. So here you can see that is the fault line. That is where the movement is happening. So this is your one plate, there's your other plate, here's the boundary. We are familiar with looking at the epicenter. So the epicenter is what we would usually see on a map. If you look on a map of an earthquake, you'll see like those rings all around it, and right in the middle is the little dot, and that's the epicenter. So that is usually where the earthquake is the strongest. But that isn't where the earthquake originates from. So the origin point of the earthquake is the focus, and the focus is straight into the ground down from the epicenter. So the definition of the epicenter is actually the point on the surface of the earth directly above the focus. So the focus is where the earthquake starts from. The epicenter is the closest point to that on the surface of the earth. Okay. So there we've got our basic definitions. Focus is where the movement happens, and the epicenter is on the ground that we usually see on a map. So P waves, if I'm not mistaken, are primary waves. Well, they're the first waves to reach, and the S waves are the second waves to reach. The P waves push through as pressure. So you can kind of see it on this diagram where you've got parts of the blocks squeezed together and the other blocks are pulled apart. I want you to rather think of it as a slinky. So if you've had one of the slinkies and you pull them apart and switch them up and you make the direction of pressure. The S waves are more up and down movement. So you can imagine it like writing S into the ground. So it's up and down movement and it's dragging the crust with it. So P waves are faster and they will radiate out and be measured first. And then S waves are slower and recorded after the peaks. This is actually one of the ways that we can figure out where the two are. Because the one travels faster than the other one, if you go to where they're as close together as possible, to figure out where the epicenter is. Okay, no, great. So I thought this was just very interesting. But S waves and P waves are also how geologists have been able to figure out the structure of the Earth. So in school, we would learn about the layers of the Earth, we learn about the crust, the outside, the mantle, the outer core, and the inner core. And one of the things that we learn about the layers of the Earth is that this is kind of like a liquid, this is a very thick viscousy liquid, and then the core, the inner core, is solid. And you always have that one person asking the question, how do you know if you can't drill through the core? We use earthquakes, measure with earthquakes. And what it basically comes down to is that the S waves can't travel through certain, um, I'll say materials, so certain densities. So you actually have a shadow over here, we've got a P wave shadow and an S wave shadow, and figuring out where we record the waves on the other side of the earth, we can figure out what is in between. So we have an epicenter at one point, and then we have certain places on the other part of the globe that are impacted by that earthquake. By looking at the places that aren't impacted, we can figure out what happens in this. And that is how geologists managed to figure out that the inner core is most likely solid. Okay. You asked that as we get to the normally no hollow Earth. You asked that as we get to the whole seismograph. But welcome to the chat. Hello, nice to meet you. Okay. Yes, we can measure the waves of the earthquake across the whole world. And we do that using a seismograph. Seismograph, basically, the seismograph, uh, in theory, moves with the movement of the earth. And the little needle will track how the seismograph moves. So this little needle is incredibly sensitive and creates a seismogram. Seismogram is that little strip of paper that we can then interpret the seismograph from. Oh, I didn't include the surface waves, but the surface waves are referred to as L waves. So we have the P wave, that's the initial recording. There you can see the little ups and downs. The S wave comes in after the P wave, you can see stronger. And then the surface waves, I do think waves are the damage causing, and they will always transfer through crust. So that won't always go up throughout the earth. Okay, that one. Is this making sense so far? I feel like I'm going through it very quickly. Okay. Then we measure it using the Richter scale. Great. So the Richter scale is a scale of 1 to 10, but each one is 10 times stronger than the previous one. And I wish I could find a nice diagram that showed it to you in a whole graph, but instead I find this one that kind of gauges what strength we are looking at each point of the Richter scale. So anything from 5 to 6 is moderate or strong. You will probably experience some damage over there depending on how prepared the place is for an earthquake. And then anything, to be fair, these are quite uncommon, very rare. Anything from 7 and up is significant and damage dealing. These little micro quakes happen quite often. They usually happen though under the ocean and we don't really feel. They don't impact us in many ways. Okay, we can somewhat predict when these earthquakes will occur. So we can figure out trends about places that frequently have earthquakes. We can record the changes in the rock, the magnetic frequencies. They can track the different gases that gets released from the ground, and you get some really cool stories of the whole animals as well. But animals somehow have a sixth sense about these kinds of things, and they even start to behave differently when they sense oncoming natural disasters. So they will combine all of these different ways of observations and predict or project when they can expect an earthquake. And to look at the places that most frequently experience earthquakes, so we looked at this map already and we looked at the way the boundaries, the plate boundaries are, and I said these will most likely have some other earthquakes. But that's not the only things that happen there. I did have a map here. Oh, there it is. So this has dotted out all major earthquake activity. It follows these lines. And this over here we call the ring of fire, Pacific Ring of Fire. But no. So this ring of fire is just scattered with earthquake hotspots and also volcanoes. That's where the whole name comes from. And it goes all the way around along the edges of these countries, following this plate boundary, and in some places it also connects over here in the ocean. So all of these countries are very frequently impacted by earthquakes. So because they are on these plate boundaries, they would expect that there's going to be earthquakes frequently and they monitor them often. Is take a little look at how some places prepare for earthquakes. And one of the most interesting is Japan. So Japan has this Tokyo's sky tree, which is considered to be earthquake. So naturally, if you're going to be building massive buildings, you have to make sure that there isn't a way that it can be toppled over. And since Japan is right here on this ring of fire, or blurred out, but since it is in the ring of fire, they need to make sure they prepare for the natural disasters. There's my, sorry, I have all of these diagrams open and I'll forget to close. There we go. One of the things that they do is that they have a core in the middle, and this core can kind of bend and sway with the movement of the earth. So if the earth is moving the one way, this core allows the building to move in the opposite direction. And the other thing it has is these buffers at the base of the building. That one, yeah, they're kind of like shock absorbers. So this isn't of the same building. I'm just using this as an explanation. So they are built into the foundations of the building. They the other here that the building is then on top of. Then when the ground moves underneath, it doesn't really disturb the building on top of it as much. Another thing that many buildings do is they use these cross braces. So if it, example, so if the earthquake moves the building, it diverges or diverts the energy into the cross beams rather than just into the structure of the building. So it splits apart the movement. Diagram. So there's just another example. So it's these dampen and reduce the movement of the building by kind of acting like shock absorbers. Oh, that's also another. Literally on springs. Yes, absolutely. Brilliant engineering. You know, if you frequently have a problem, you find a way to fix it. I suppose there is no simpler solution than putting something onto springs. And then this one was also really cool. Where is it? Oh, this is another building in Japan. They have a pendulum in the middle of the building. So the pendulum, look over here, I think it's some built in some there. Well, I can't really tell this. But it swings into the opposite direction of the building's movement. So if the building is swaying the one way, the pendulum will swing in the opposite way. And that will counter the movement and just reduce the overall movement. And it will keep swinging as the building is moving and reduces the overall movement. There you can see it's just chilling there. You kind of see it from this. But this one is really cool. I don't think I'll be able to find a video clip of it. but this just sits on the top of this tall skyscraper, and it's just free hanging. I think it's actually a tourist destination. A lot of people go and visit. Um, you can go check it out, and it's just hanging there. And as the building moves, it swings in the opposite direction, this massive, heavy weight, and reduces all of the movement. So I thought these were really cool examples. Not only do they know that earthquakes occur, they track how often they occur and they try to predict when they will occur, but they also build their skyscrapers around these. In your less developed countries, they don't always have these same resources. Your less developed countries, they don't necessarily have the technology to predict that an earthquake will be arriving, and they don't really have the finances or the resources to build up an industry like this. And even if an earthquake does come, I'm sure that places like Japan are far better equipped to deal with the fallout of a natural disaster than your less developed countries. So, the overall devastation of an earthquake on an LEDC or a poorer country is significantly worse than an MEDC or a more developed country. And since I am doing these lessons from South Africa, I always like to refer back to South African case studies. And I was doing a little bit of homework, and this was South Africa's most powerful earthquake. And it was really interesting for me because we don't really sit. So there's South Africa. We are really far away from anything earthquake resembling. But these are just the major plate boundaries. There are also minor little fault lines within the plates, and those little fault lines can also trigger earthquakes. So you wouldn't think South Africa earthquake, but we did have one. We did have one really significant, and that was in 1969. So 1969, I think it was 6.3. I thought I read 6. Okay, 6.3, right? I just want to double check that. Sources? Not really. Oh, yeah, no, it's supposed to say 6.3. Okay, so I must have misread initially. So 6.3. Unfortunately, it did lead to some deaths, and it's devastating considering that 6.3 is probably not much or insignificant to any place that is used to an earthquake. But being in the middle of South Africa, in a place where we don't experience earthquakes, that would be devastating. And I actually know of family members that were impacted by this earthquake. They live in that Cirrus area and they were impacted by this earthquake. So it's an interesting little part of our history. And since, like I said, since we weren't prepared for it, since South Africa isn't prepared for natural disasters like this, the consequences were so much worse. Do you guys know of any earthquakes in your area? Since we still have time, we can look at some case studies. Um, where are you from, Belinda? We can maybe see if we can find some iconic or Estonia. Um, Find you. Do you have any earthquakes where you are? Seems like there was one. Oh, there we go. In 1976. Yes. Most powerful earthquake recorded in Estonia caused rock falls along the northern and northeast coast. So that's actually an interesting point that I forgot to mention. Yeah, you learned something new that we have that you guys have with earthquakes. But that's actually an interesting point that we forget to mention that earthquakes aren't just isolated natural disasters. The earthquake obviously has impacts of its own, but it can trigger secondary disasters. So the fact that this one triggered a rock fall, usually when we think about earthquakes triggering disasters, it will be a tsunami. But tsunamis aren't usually the only impact of earthquakes. Earthquake can trigger all kinds of mass movements. Oh wow, you had a rock fall there. Are there any others? Can we find more? Maybe check in the news? Ah, I hate all those pop-ups. Okay, generally considered a low risk. I think that makes sense. If we look at our map over here, there, there is Europe and there is all of the plate boundaries. The only plate boundary that you're near is a divergent plate boundary, so that wouldn't typically cause any earthquakes anyway. So that makes sense that you'd be quite low risk. Ah, but being near coastline, there is also the risk of some tsunamis. That's interesting. Oh, Markos Cape. We can check. Markos, find that Africa lines. How fast the tsunami reaches the shore depends on how close the tsunami is. To be fair, in that instance, I think it was just a little bit of paranoia. Some people felt a little tremor of an earthquake, but it wasn't really strong and it was very far out to sea. And then I think when people heard that it was far out to sea, they thought, does that mean tsunami? So they suddenly panicked, but there wasn't actually a risk of tsunami. When the tsunami reaches the shore completely depends on how fast the waves are moving and how far it is from the. Okay, so we do have that here. So these little lines are supposed to be the fault lines. Sorry, this is not a very clear map. This is the best one I could find. So here's the Cape Fold Belt. So there's definitely a small little, a minor fault line there and another one there. So this must have been the trigger of the Tilbach earthquake. You can see this little cluster over there. You can see none of them are really over 6.6. There's another one on here. Milkbus. So you mentioned the multiple strand tape. So there are some small fault lines over here. I think it is worth me explaining the difference between a fault line and a plate boundary. So a fault line is what happens when rock is bent and moved. Try to show you faulting and folding. You can kind of think of them as like two parts of a process. So folding would just be the bending of the rock layers. So the folding is a very gradual bend. Okay, there they make it look glorious and violent, but fold folding a rock. There we go. That's a nice example. So this is your folded rock. It makes like these waves in the rock. Then eventually you get to the point where the rock can't be folded anymore and it cracks, it breaks. That is the fault line. This is all fold lines. Ah, there's a nice example. And then here you can see, so we had these layers of rock. So we have the bottom layer, we have another layer, a third layer on the top. By the way, a layer of rock is strata. So this was obviously trying to be moved and it didn't want to be moved, so it broke. And you have this crack over there. That is a fault line. Here we can see it again. We've got the layers, the strata. It was being moved, but it couldn't move, so it cracked and it created a fault line. So that is what we're looking at here. These lines is where the crust would have been moved, but it's not able to move anymore, cracks and creates a fault line. So naturally, with these fault lines, there is still then space for more movement, and then it makes sense that we would have earthquakes over there, even though it's not on a plate boundary. So that probably would be the background of your earthquake as well. Where was it again? Yeah, there's this one. I'm afraid I can't pronounce that name. I'm sorry. So here we go. So that probably would have been the same situation. Because it's not near a plate boundary, it would have been on a fault line. So some kind of movement along that fault line, and we had a note. We can also take a second to look at tsunamis if you want. Diagram? Tectonic plates. Okay, so this is another nice diagram. I actually think this is the same one I had a minute ago. That just explains the plate tectonics again. Is it? Kind of, yes. So you have the divergent plates over there, the plates that are being pushed apart. You've got the magma that's being squeezed in between. And as it squeezes, it pushes the crust to either side so it can emerge. And that as it pushes that plate apart, this is pressed underneath the other crust. So the oceanic crust being denser, pressed underneath the continental crust, and it forms new oceanic crust. And if we have all of these plate boundaries, we also have some subduction over here, oceanic crust being forced under more oceanic crust. So this is a hotspot for earthquakes. And if we have major earthquakes over there, we can have a tsunami. There we go. So there you have an earthquake happening, and it will cause a wave, and that wave will just come rushing water into the coastline and completely flooding the coastline. That's actually another nice diagram. So here we have the fault line. Here we have that point over there. If you remember, that is the focus. And then directly above it would be the epicenter. And then you have all of this movement of ground that's being shoved up and down, and that will create waves and ripples out in the ocean, hence your tsunami. And tsunamis are different to other waves. Tsunamis are flooding waves. So they don't just come crashing in. I always love these diagrams, these photos of a tsunami. Oh, Milnerton fault line? Okay, I'll check that out now. These. I always love these photos of tsunamis because they're really not realistic at all. A tsunami won't crest like a normal wave. It's a flooding wave. So that, beautiful imagery. Completely unrealistic, but I love them. So they won't crest, they won't break or curve like a normal wave. They come in like a wall of flood. So you see it over here. It's just this wall of water that comes rushing in, and everything in the area gets flooded to that point. So there you can see it again. This massive movement of water. Okay, let's check out that fault line. Yes. Oh, okay. Beneath the Cape. Oh, right. Wow. Okay. What? Oh. Okay, it's fine. We'll find a different map. Beneath the Cape Flats. Okay, an intraplate fault line known as the Milnerton fault line extends beneath the Cape Flats in a northwesterly to northeasterly direction. Seismic activity associated with this intraplate fault is considered responsible for the largest earthquake experienced by the city of Cape Town in 1809. Okay, I'm gonna actually go check out what that earthquake was. First, let's take a look at the maps. I have so many things open. Let's just close some of these. We don't need all. Really don't. Oh, that's not where I wanted to go. Go back. Took me to Molmerton. Oh, at the power station. Here, so I think can't really make out the map, but is this supposed to be the fault line? I think this dotted line just cutting across the cape. Here a map. Oh, no, that says cut. Mind. That seems to be the only map of it. Yeah, this seems to be the only map of it. So if this is Cape Town, so Cape Town is generally around here on this point, and then here it cuts through. So if we can picture it with, why did I close Google Earth? Of all the things, that was the one that should have stayed open. Okay, okay. Oh, that's, yeah, there we go. Oh, I wonder if we can kind of see some of that. That. Let's open this picture a little bit bigger. It's the image much bigger. It's fine. We can kind of see, here's the cape, there's the fault line. So it cuts through like that. There. I'm curious to see if we can see any kind of, because it's completely developed, we wouldn't be able to. Any type of geological features that hint at there being a fault line over there. Sometimes you can. Sometimes you can see these very faint lines or rock formations that shows that something was happening there. But I suppose because this is developed and built up, we won't really see that kind of scarring in the landscape. So it would be stretching right through Cape Town like that. There. So then it's almost surprising that they don't have more little tremors. So they mentioned that there was an earthquake in, is it 1809? That? Oh, yes. And you see, this is what confuses me. Because here they say that Cape Town had a 6.5 Richter scale earthquake in 1809. But then when we were looking at Tilbach earlier, they said that the 1969 earthquake in Tilbach, 6.3, was the strongest in South Africa. That's why I'm saying it wasn't making sense. I don't know. Okay, so on the 4th of December, Cape Town was hit by an earthquake measuring 6.5 on the Richter scale, the biggest recorded earthquake to have hit the area. The quake was caused by the Milnerton Fault. So there's the fault that you mentioned, the Milnerton Fault running across Milnerton area, yes, the Cape Flats, and right through the city center. There wasn't much infrastructure for the quake to destroy, leaving only fissures in the ground, and a quake of that magnitude would have devastated if it hit the area today due to the increased population and infrastructure. Absolutely. I mean, I'm looking at the map over here, and if that's going to cut straight through the city, that would leave some devastating damage because a lot of this is informal settlements. I can't make it out on the maps. So I'll just go over here so you can see what I mean. Example. I'm trying to just find an image of what I mean by an informal settlement. Why I say that they would be really hard hit. Oh, don't tell me it runs 8 k's away from the Kugelberg nuclear plant. No one wants that. A Kugelberg nuclear plant is, I think it's South Africa's only nuclear power plant, if I'm not mistaken. Um, and the fact that it's so close to a fault line, let's not think about that too hard. This informal settlement. Yes. Okay. So this is an informal settlement. In other words, it hasn't been built up with proper services, proper roads, anything that would make this actually livable for people, and yet they make do over here. Terrible. So if we had a massive earthquake, we can tell that neighborhoods like this would be destroyed. People would lose everything. There's one thing for a house to kind of have its foundations left behind, but here there's nothing built. So you can see Cape Town would in no way, shape, or form be prepared for an earthquake that goes through the city itself. Let's just check where Kuburg is because now that's going to give everyone. No, sorry, it's fighting me. Go back. It. Go. Kuburg is somewhere. There we go. So there's the Kuburg nuclear power station. Let's just zoom out so we can see where it is on the map. And okay, there's the power station, and there is the fault line. I think that's like about there-ish in comparison. Yeah, that's far too close for comfort. So Cape Town is definitely not prepared for an earthquake. Let's hope that it's not on the cards for us. At least from all of those news articles, we can see that there are a lot of minor quakes that happen over there. So that is definitely linked to the fault lines there. So there's a lot of minor quakes right around there, probably because of the fault lines. We're not immune to earthquakes. Okay, well, that was all that I wanted to cover for today. And are there any questions from your side? Are we understanding earthquakes? Are there any last questions from you guys, or maybe any topics that you would like me to cover in the next chat? Coffee's okay. Okay. Well, I hope that you guys have a great week further, and that you hopefully learned something interesting. And then I'll see you again soon. Cheers!